Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are tuned in from around the world. I'm Mark Bain, the CEO of the KYB, a business that provides the world's largest, most accurate primary sourced data to verified customers. I'll be your host for the next 50 odd minutes, and we hope to bring you some insights into the world of UBOs and along that subject matter, and hopefully you'll get some learning along the way. To bring this subject to life, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest speakers. Firstly, up on the podium is Mike Harris. And it's fair to say, give a wave, Mike. It's fair to say Mike is a professional at this. He's a pro and a leadership across multiple industries for many years. And since 2008, he's been tackling the world's financial crime issues, specializing in data-driven solutions and holding certificates like ACABs. Mike is a recognized authority and a leader, and having written many articles on financial crime and advised organizations on compliance. And we welcome you to the webinar and look forward to a compelling discussion with you, Mike.
Thank you, Mark.
That's all right. To help us to add a bit of color and flavor to the discussion, I would like to welcome Louis Vargas. Louis has over 10 years of experience in financial crime. Is he there? He is there. Yes, there we are. Give us a wave, Louis. As a founder and a chair of certified financial crime specialist for the Nordic region and a leading compliance officer, having worked for many top financial institutions and leading fintechs across US and the EU. Louis brings a practical and logical approach to this forum, and we look forward to a healthy discussion in which we can all learn something. So, guys, would you like to add anything to the comments? Have I missed anything of your accolades?
No, all good
from my side.
Great, fantastic. Good, fantastic. So, the purpose of our next 50 minutes will be talking, as I mentioned, around the UBO screening and the compliances that go with that subject. As we all know, well, as most of us know, at least here, this is a challenging milestone when it comes to achieving this. And it's the conundrum of understanding who the ultimate beneficial owner is. Can be a real tricky situation as we go around the globe, and offers us some real difficulties when it comes to certain sanction lists. So I'll kick off with the first kind of questions to the rest of the audience that's listening in. If you've got any questions, then please add them in on your LinkedIn or what forum you're watching this on, and we'll come to those if we have time at the end. But we should be able to do that. So, Louis, I'd like you to pitch in first, if I may. And I think I'm going to give you a question around what your consideration is. How does inconsistent data points across jurisdictions impact the KYB compliance efforts?
Yeah, I think the issue is we have to start with the kind of unified definition, right? To have a level set of what the understanding of the requirements are for not only your organization, but also where you operate. So those are very key items to kind of start with. So we have to go back to like the fundamentals of as it were, to really try to ensure we get it right. Because you'll be surprised to know, or maybe not so surprised, but different parts of the business could use the same KYC tool in different ways. So I think that's why it's best to kind of get on a level playing field to ensure that we understand all the information that's being gathered, utilizing the correct data fields, and then that just makes hopefully makes our lives in compliance a bit more easier, because now we know what exactly we're looking at and what we have to drive toward. And now when you're speaking about different jurisdictions, the issue, I think it's more prevalent in the EU than it is in the US, right? Because in the US, it's kind of one law of the land. In the EU, you have many member states. So, there's different kind of understandings or interpretations of the law. So now you run into that. So just to summarize, we just have to put our best foot forward.
Mike, would you add to that? I mean, it's obviously it's a difficult part when you're coming to be compliant when you can't get the data. Or Mike, you're on the mute.
The fatal mistake. Apologies. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Louis has shared, because data is key to this. So we'll talk a lot more about data as we go through, and obviously the task of identifying The UBO of any organization is really all about access to data. So, I'm sure we'll go into this in a lot more detail, but that's where the real challenge lies. So, then obviously comparing that across jurisdictions becomes an even more complex equation to deal with. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll pick up this further.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sort of segues me into the next question, really, Mike. When as you're there at front and forward, compliance professionals, right? Their main challenges is identifying and screening UBOs. I mean, what do you think their main challenges in doing that?
Yeah, well, I think we've already said at the highest level, it's data, but what causes that? I think, I thought about this beforehand, and I was thinking, if you're any financial institution or professional service institution subject to AML regulations anywhere, you've got a difficult task on your hand, because your first obligation is in a KYC sense, understanding who you're doing business with. And when you look at the detail of what you need in terms of information to do that job properly, it's considerable. And as I was looking back into my own notes that I use frequently to look at the differences between, what information I need to onboard an individual versus a business. And there's no doubt it's far more complex in terms of the amount of data, the amount of information that I need when I'm actually onboarding a business. And it's not just data on an individual and verifying that data. You're collecting an awful lot of information. That's the initial step. And then you're verifying that information. And then you're needing documents to go with that. And beyond that, we have then got the job of understanding the organization. Our risk assessment process is requiring us to understand what the business is doing, what the potential might be in that business for anything to do with money laundering or even terrorist financing, a la the regulations themselves, and really building a picture that tells us what level of due diligence might be appropriate when we're onboarding that entity to begin with. Add to that the complexity of identifying the beneficial owners and the ultimate beneficial owner, and as we'll no doubt get onto, these are challenges that are made more difficult by the external environment. Where do I go to get this data? And I think, when I was thinking about this aspect, yes, there's been a lot of concerted effort around the world to improve the quality of data in live registries, for example. There's still only, I think, something like 70 or 80 live registries around the world. And when you look at that, when you look at the quality of the data, there are three issues with it. It's both the quality, it's the completeness, and it's the governance of that data. Can I rely on it for my regulatory obligations? Is that data good enough for my purposes? And that's really where there are live registries. And what do you do when there aren't? We've seen a growth in terms of the commitment by governments to introduce public registers, although that's a bit of a rocky road. The EU decision 18 months ago, turned that around quite dramatically. So we've got a variable picture. We've got public registers of data that are, partially complete, but by no means around the world. We've got corporate registries that, are variable in terms of what data is available. So when you add all those things together, the job of a compliance officer in onboarding a business is not an easy one. And, finding the data, getting that data in the first place is really challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Just if
suppose
I
that,
could
I was about to ask you, Louis, because the very point here is that, how do you comply? I think that's the question now.
For sure. I mean, you run into a lot of issues, as was already raised. I think the operational task and burden is super interesting to look at, right? Because data is king, but you also need people to source that data. So not only through data providers, but even when you have the data source, now you need to, have some people to look through it, find out what's accurate, pull the necessary information out. So getting the data, the verification of the data, that's very much an operational burden. And our compliance has always said we're not a compliance generator, but we're a compliance, revenue generator, but revenue taker. And unfortunately, that's the paradigm we face. But it's essential. Unfortunately, we're getting better with utilizing data, but right now, still the name of the game is we need people in the seats to really sift through the information. Um, and you're going to the point of, the registries that are available. Yes, they're, some of them, most of them are free, but some of them are behind paywalls. Some of them are very difficult to read. They don't have, uh, native translators that are part of the system, so you have to pull it and then try to translate it yourself. So yeah, just a very uh, interesting task trying to, get the right details in front of you. And also, beneficial owners, right? Sometimes some data providers gets you so far deep, and you might think that's the end. You found the UBO, but then you find another data source, and you see there's a trail behind it. So I think also understanding where kind of the data points are truly at the ultimate level or not is pretty tricky to understand. So again, as I said before, we're just trying to do the best we can to try to stay out ahead of it, and have as much information as we can to make the appropriate decision. A key point in this is that um, it's also an operational task, but we shouldn't have cookie cutter approaches when it comes to KYC, because then that's when we get into trouble also, right? Because there's different businesses that require different types of due diligence, different risk assessments. So, most companies that I've seen, it's, pretty standard. They're like, oh, this is the KYC structure, that's it. And that's where I feel that a lot of blind spots come from.
Yeah.
So if we have something tailored that really speaks to the types of customers you have, that's heading in the right direction. Um, but I think also, sorry, the problem we have to consider is not only about our immediate customers, right? We have to know our customer's customer. We have to understand supply chains. So it's no more just the customer that's sitting in front of us. So there's more kind of due diligence that's out there that's needed to really address the risks and really get to the spirit of the regulations and not just the letter of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's. I read last week that one of the MPs was saying it's going to be $32 billion is going to be increased in expenditure on AML um, compliance as it extends out. So what I'm hearing from you is that, I suppose a little question, as a side question to this is, do you know when to stop? Do you know when you're digging deep, do you know when to stop? How do you know in there? Because I'm hearing that actually you're not quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, it varies, with experience levels, but also kind of sometimes the gut feeling as a compliance officer, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's something that, we've discussed before, within my network is sometimes there's analysis paralysis, right? Sometimes you just have too much data that it just, you freeze because there's too much to really sift through. And then there's other times where you don't have enough data and you just have to make a judgment call. That's the blessing and the curse of the day and age we live in, with technology getting as good as it's getting.
Yeah.
It's not so much anymore the blind spots, and more so how to appropriately use the technology that we have, how to really get the key eyes on the data we need and not just be drowning under the data.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
a good,
Absolutely. Yeah.
if I could just comment on that as
Yeah.
well. I'm sorry, we may be going a little bit divergent here, but this ties in very nicely to implementation of the risk-based approach. And it's back to that fundamental issue, which has been around for a long time. Are we looking to, as a regulated entity, are we looking to implement the regulations for the benefit of the regulator, or are we doing it to actually understand, the risks of financial crime across our portfolio of third parties, clients, and as Louis said, maybe suppliers, etc. And I think, the fact is that there's a tendency to do more than we maybe need to do to be on the safe side. And I think, back to the risk-based approach, so important that we get that initial risk assessment right when we're deciding whether or not, first of all, we can even deal with this particular customer or third party. Obviously, if there's sanctions issues, if there's some sort of legal reason that we can't, then that's a different discussion. But if there are factors that link to our risk appetite as a business that come into play, then we really got to do a good job in that initial risk assessment process. And there is huge pressure on compliance budgets everywhere. It's here in the UK, the government's just launched a survey about this to ask regulated entities, about the costs of compliance and gather some data, because there's no doubt the budgets everywhere are massive. We're talking in billions, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know from the KYB's perspective, we are inundated at the moment with inquiries on UBO.
Yeah.
And of course, we're getting a plethora of difference, I suppose, from the educated and the non, and they just believe that somewhere out there this information is available. But
the magic button. You press the magic button.
Yeah, and I wish we had the magic button.
Wish we had one.
We're not magicians, but we're certainly uncovering things, put it that way. But I suppose you touched on a point there, Mike, and that was more around the disparities between multinationals. So, when you're doing a regulatory requirements, you've got to be adhering to that. But if you're doing cross-border, what does that mean? Does that mean it might be one rule here, one rule there. What do we abide to, I suppose, is the question. What ways do regulatory disparities from multinational companies they complicate the compliance efforts?
Well, absolutely. Which jurisdiction is going to prevail when you're implementing the regulations for the entity that you're dealing with? And obviously that's going to be down to the local situation of where the entity is based, where you're based, etc. But undoubtedly, there are disparities between interpretation of the regulations in different countries. And this really, it's worth just touching briefly on the role of the Financial Action Task Force, in this whole area of UBOs. As anybody in the industry is well aware, FATF has played a pivotal role in developing the UBO regulation that's increasingly been implemented by member countries, which are, it's a significant number of countries now, well over 100 and something, who subscribe to the FATF 40 recommendations and implement those in their, individual country regulations. So we've had a gradual convergence going on over a period of time. Certainly the EU has been very active in that way by implementing what's been called the EU directives over a period of many years to bring conformity in the way the regulations are implemented across each of the countries. Although even up until recently, there's still been quite a lot of disparity, even within the EU bloc. And obviously, up until Brexit, the UK was very much part of that, and still has pretty much a lot of commonality. So, from that perspective, there's been convergence, and FATF has continuously been updating its recommendations. I think it's recommendation 24 that deals with beneficial ownership. And anybody listening, it's worth keeping a weather eye on what FATF is saying. And even quite recently, there's been additional pronouncements as they've sought to beef up the recommendation 24 in terms of ultimate beneficial ownership and the importance of it, and the expectations within the individual country as to what needs to be done. So as I say, there's a convergence going on. We're moving towards a sort of much higher standard of expectation and conformity across jurisdictions. Nevertheless, if you're a multinational, you're still dealing with regional variations. There's a bit of catch up going on some areas, but collectively there's a lot more intergovernmental focus on this. 3 pieces of key related regulation. In the US, we've got the Corporate Transparency Act, which is going to be implementing a much higher standard of beneficial ownership and requirement to report UBOs and to have that information available for the so-called competent authorities. The same thing in the EU. Now there's an agreement with under AMLA, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, that will be consistently applied across the entire block. And in the UK, more recently, we had the Economic Crime Corporate Transparency Act, which, same thing, it's bringing about better standards of corporate governance around data. We keep coming back to data. It's the key to this whole subject, and the quality of that data has to be improved. So all these things gradually make a difference, but it takes time. So we still got to deal with disparity between different jurisdictions, disparity between the quality of data that we can get from public sources, even corporate registries, as we said. And in the meantime, we still got the obligation to make sure that we're happy with the work that we've done, and we can satisfy the regulator to show that we've done our job properly to identify, potential anti-money money laundering, terrorist financing risk, and we've done our job to identify the beneficial owners and the ultimate beneficial owner of any business clients. So the owner stays with us, but the external environment still has lots of challenges. And if you're a multinational organization, you're very familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that you really, we're going to ask now, Louis, as being the officer who has to do this. So I think, how do you ensure, you can't get the UBO information, it's incomplete. What do you do? How do you ensure that your AML regulations are up to date when they're not official and it's not there?
Again, doing the best we can, right? So just utilizing the data sources we have. And I think it's often forgotten is having a good relationship with your client, and helping them understand that, you ask them questions because you need to help protect them, is not just to be an annoyance to them. Here in the Nordics, I feel like sometimes they get a bit weary of talking to their clients because they're like, well, they've been a customer of ours for so long. If we ask them more questions, they're going to think that we don't trust them. And yeah, trust is key, but as Mike brought up earlier, we need that documentation to prove it. So it's just having those conversations and getting on the same page. That's like, okay, to really support you as best we can, we need up-to-date information. We need, all these data points, not only to protect you, but also to ensure that, we're handling your business as appropriate as possible, right? Because when we don't know, then we end up questioning even more. Uh, we end up stopping payments that because it doesn't seem it's within, the business's kind of normal course of business, when they could have just told us, okay, things have changed now, we do this or do that. So I think it's very important, you know, to ensure that you have this good relationship with your customer, so that they could come to you with questions they have, but also updates that they have to their business.
Yeah.
And we're seeing also on the technical side, um, there's ways that different providers are pitching, like a perpetual KYC, where it's ongoing KYC, so not just kind of in a batch sense, or relying on kind of the periodic way that we've been doing it, but more of a rolling process. So I think it's still too soon to tell which one is a better approach. So I think it's just basically, it just boils down to, as we said before, just treating, understanding the risk of the business, doing a proper risk assessment, and trying to stay on top of it that way. There's, for some reason, I'm not sure why, but KYC seems to be forgotten a lot of time, where, when there's a lot of competing priorities, they're like, okay, well, we could just do KYC later. And to me, it doesn't make any sense, right? If you're building a car, you don't say, well, I have all the pieces, but we don't need the instructions. We have to
Yeah.
get down as I said before, the fundamentals, and that's where it all starts, is understanding our customer, getting the right data points so that we're treating them appropriately when we're, reviewing their activities. And if we're not getting that right, it doesn't matter what tools, what bells and whistles we have,
Yeah.
there's still going to be a lot of friction.
Yeah. I think I had this conversation with someone last week, and they're in a similar question, really, or similar subject matter. And you just reminded me, because he liked it to a car, and he said, you wouldn't build a car with no brakes. And I'm not saying compliance is the brake, but you can't have a car with no brakes.
Right.
So, which is a good point, really. You're not
Yeah.
presenting it. And then the other part about is we talk about know your customer, but really, really know who your customer is through its life cycle. Who is that customer? What do they do? How do they do it? And having a good relationship with that customer. And it kind of brings me on to sorry, Mike. Yeah, go on.
No, I was going to say that's so important point, Mark, because the important point is, of course, we focus on the onboarding process, KYC/KYB. We've got that third party, that customer on board. But as we all know, risk is dynamic and things change over time. It links into what Louis just shared about the model of perpetual KYC. Now, you may not need perpetual KYC on every customer relationship, but you certainly need to be having some sort of way of monitoring significant change, because I've come across many organizations who've got what I call sleepers in their portfolio without realizing it, because of course they onboarded at a point in time, passed the tests, or maybe the tests weren't stringent enough and they missed things, we don't know. But the fact is they then are active in your organization, consuming your services, etc., but suddenly they no longer meet the risk criteria, and you could have something potentially damaging reputationally, or even worse, sat in your portfolio. So you must have some sort of way of monitoring the changing profile of the risk profile of the third parties, the customers that you're dealing with. And I think that's a really important feature, and certainly around the world, regulators are emphasizing more and more the need for continuous monitoring, ensuring that.
Do you think, Mike, the trigger-based screening, there's something happens, it's normal. You onboard someone, they're very nice and squeaky clean, and then suddenly, there's transactions going through Luxembourg. What's going on? And that kind of thing.
Yeah, that my point, and I've seen this many times, in working in the area of enhanced due diligence, which is a sort of area of speciality. When you actually dig that little bit deeper to understand what's going, the fact is that when we talk about financial criminals, they're a smart community. They want to access our financial services and professional services because they need them, and they need them to undertake their illicit activity. They need the accountant to provide them with accounting services to enable their illegal transactions to happen within some sort of corporate structure that needs creating. So the classic tactic is to create a very credible initial interface with the organization to get through the barriers, if you like. Our guard is a little bit lower, it looks low risk, we take it on board, and then what's something I called in a previous article, transaction creep happens, because gradually over a period of time we're sucked into providing things that, if we were challenging it as if a new client, would be a big red flag. And we'd be looking at that and saying, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't seem quite right. Why am I being asked to complete this extremely complex corporate structure with all sorts of idiosyncrasies and building trusts into it, and it looks circular? And I've seen a number of these. Trying to unpack them is extremely difficult. Huge red flag. But it all started very innocently with setting up something that was quite innocuous, quite easy. But once through the gates, then they can start consuming the services for their illicit activities. And we've got to be smart to this, collectively, and not naive to the fact that these things actually happen.
Yeah. And your experience from that, Louis, from the trigger-based screening, is that something that you undertake in your role now? Is it something that you have as an application?
Yeah, I mean, it's I would say it's more on the kind of still in the traditional sense for the most part. I think we're trying to get to the place where it can be more trigger based. But I think there's still some growing pains on how to make sure that's really effective, or how we can be more effective with that approach. But obviously it makes more logical sense to kind of understand when these kind of triggers happen. But then again, it's you run into the problem of having a level or equal understanding of what should trigger that, right? So one bank might have one interpretation, another bank might have a different interpretation. So then you run into those types of issues. But as long as you have kind of the tone from the top in your organization, that goes a long way in ensuring that that's set up appropriately.
If I just
Yeah.
just come back on a point here, Mark, briefly, if I may, because I know we're going to move on.
Yeah.
But technology is key in this process. Understanding that we have the technology to deal with these issues and it's available, and it relies on what we would all know as open source intelligent or OSINT is really important in this process, because if you're relying on static curated data sets to manage ongoing risk, you're at risk of not knowing when something significant changes. So the technology solutions that are now available using open source intelligence actually help you to monitor that risk on an ongoing basis and be alerted to a trigger event that happens that suddenly you should be aware of and doing something about in your due diligence process and customer relationship. So the technology is key in this, as well as in finding the relevant data that's live and current.
So how are you seeing at the moment businesses verifying their data using that information from sources at the moment? See that you were talking about stored, but talking about real-time sourcing. How are you seeing business verify that?
Well, we've still got a variable picture. We've still got lots of firms who are reliant upon curated data sets. That's a fact. Access through to live corporate registry data is something that there are solution providers, and obviously the KYB is one of those who's bringing that to the terminal, if you like, the compliance analyst's armory. Really important. But it's obviously, as well as that, it's the additional areas of risk that you need to be aware of. So it's whether there's significant changes in ownership. Suddenly the UBO has changed, or the UBO's got links that we weren't aware of before that we should be aware of. And that's where the power of sort of open source intelligence can help you understand those networks, visualize them, and show you, joining the dots, if you like, of where where those connections are. Because quite commonly that's how the criminals will hide and disguise their ultimate sort of ownership and the sort of the powers beyond the immediate organization. I think you touched on that at the beginning, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely.
But real-time data key.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So just changing the key slightly here, Louis. We talked about it before. Being compliant, remaining in that way, and you have that challenge, of course, which I don't envy you in that sense. But I got asked this question actually the other day, and so transparency, I was kind of like not stumped, but I was kind of like, well, what would I do in this situation? So how do shell companies across the jurisdictions, how do you uncover it? So how do they contribute to the challenge? You hit a shell company, it is, but you can't go anywhere else. How do you keep compliant?
No, it's true. I mean, it's definitely a red flag, but what I want to remind everyone is that a shell company is not automatically indication or indicative of nefarious activity, right? This is something that a lot of companies use for various reasons, but it's again, it takes to have the appropriate communication with your customer to understand why they're set up this way. More so than not, when I've run into shell companies and research, it's usually who my customer is doing business with, and then that's the other set of questions. Um, but yeah, I mean that is definitely a red flag. But again, it's not really means you have to offboard the customer. So I think
Right.
that hopefully gives people a bit of peace of mind when hearing that. But we still need to fully understand why they have something like this in place, and doing the due diligence we need to do in a normal course of business. And it just boils down to, as we said before, an honest conversation with your customer, and having the verification in place that's needed. Um, yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a silver bullet for that one, but that's how I see it and have come across it in the day to day.
Mm.
But something that Mike mentioned a lot before is, we need to have the verification in place. So it's fine and dandy that they provide us an explanation, but we need to also try to, find a synergy via OSINT or other data providers to say, okay, does this make sense or not? So trust is good, but we also need to verify that.
Yeah, to unwrap that as well. Mike,
I've
have
got
you got some comment on it?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because I knew we'd come to the point where we were talking about secrecy havens, offshore jurisdictions, how we
Yeah,
unpack a shell company, because it's inevitably going to be a challenge for everybody when we come to that place. And the Panama Papers, and subsequent sort of investigations have told us very clearly that there are lots of nefarious reasons as well as very legitimate reasons for creating an offshore entity and having a shell company in that structure. But what do you do as a compliance analyst when you hit that brick wall? You've reached it, you've got to that level in your corporate unpacking. So I thought, well, okay, what do firms actually do? Because you just can't go to any registry and pick up that data. It doesn't exist. It's not there in public domain, or even as a competent authority, it's not available to you. So the sorts of things that you have to develop are a knowledge of additional sources of data in that particular jurisdiction. So, for example, we could be looking at British Virgin Islands, which is notoriously a black hole for corporate data. We could be looking at the Bahamas, which is less so, all of those sorts of territories. What additional data sources are available? Because clearly, if you've got the ability and the technology to go searching amongst those, it's amazing what companies disclose informally and give you information about, so you can find that. Coming back to the entity that you're onboarding, that you're looking at, understanding where it does its business can also give you some helpful clues as to where you might go to get data. Because, for example, a business that's offshore centered in one jurisdiction but doing business, let's say in Florida, which would be a good example of how it happens, you would say, well, okay, it may well have to register in some way, shape, or form to do business in that overseas jurisdiction. It may well have to lodge a registry for, I don't know, a trademark or something, or a license that it has to do, that's a government requirement. So there are clues that you can pick up. And when you pick up those clues, you can actually go to those data sources and have a look. And you can see, because it may be that in actually registering their activities, they've disclosed important information that helps you understand who the directors and shareholders are. So there's tactics that you can adopt when it comes to the secrecy haven issue that can give you clues and help you understand and find data in other ways. Back to the same thing, you need the tools for that and the knowledge of understanding where it's going. And you couldn't possibly do it for every single entity, but if you've got high risk, you'd certainly want to be thinking about that.
Yeah, and I mean, immediately it's ringing dollars cost to serve at that point.
Yeah.
If you've got boots on the ground to go and do that, or however that is, or if you haven't got tools to do it, you've got your own team to do it, then it's time. Time's money.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good point. Yeah, very good adding into that point, Mike. I'm going to talk about now the implications. So basically, if you're relying on out of date data, it's a ringing tune, isn't it? What does it mean to the organization? What's the implication to you as an organization? Obviously, we've seen lots of fines, but maybe from your experience, what does that expose the particular company to?
Who wants to take this one first? Louis, do you want to kick off on this one?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it depends how you look at it, right? It could either be you're flying blind or you have the blinders on, right? Because it's data from a specific point in time. It's not dynamic. So, um, yeah, and unfortunately, this is the way it was, and for the most part, still is today. We're learning from those mistakes, but it still takes time to adjust to kind of new approaches. Nobody likes change. Also, when it involves money, right? Because as Mike mentioned multiple times, and also you mentioned, time, we have to pay for these things, right? For data sources, for technology, and all that stuff. So those are all challenges in this space. So yeah, I guess just to quickly summarize, I mean, dealing with outdated data, it's pretty much, you're relying on already data that's really you don't know if it's still valid or not, and being able to fully um, say that you're compliant based on old data, that's a stretch. But again, that's kind of what it has been. I think we're seeing the wheels are in motion for things to change. And I think regulators will also start expecting these things. It hasn't really come out yet, but I think it's coming because, we always know that, especially when we're talking about, criminals and nefarious activity, they're always out ahead of us. So for us to really try to be as close to them as possible, we might not ever be ahead of them, but at least to try to get as close to them as possible, we need to be a bit more dynamic, and that's unfortunately the way we have to go. So yeah, it's going to take some investment, but yeah, we'll have to see how that goes. But yeah, right now it is pretty much just trusting that things are the way the way they are as they were was told to us.
So on the implication of that, I think the point I was
Hmm.
trying to get into really was, and it's not really, it's probably a question that's just in floating around in my head actually more than anything else, is that if I'm a compliance officer and I've gone and got stored data that's out of date, but that is all I can get, or
Hmm.
I think that's all I can get, I've got it from a
Right.
reputable source,
Yeah.
am I exposing my organisation to a fine? I suppose, Mike, you could probably pitch into that.
Well, potentially you are, aren't you?
Yeah.
Because
Hmm.
you've just increased the amount of risk to your organization that you've made a decision, because ultimately, we're using sort of legally based processes here. We're
Yeah.
relying, as it says in the question, there's a legality in that term in itself. We're relying on data that's outdated, that's inaccurate, incomplete, as I was saying earlier on, to make a decision about providing our services to a particular client. Now, if we got that wrong, we are actually putting our organization and if you're the MLRO, you're putting
Yeah.
yourself, your nominated officer, at risk, because clearly, there's a legal requirement to have, use best endeavors, whatever the phrase might be. That's probably not the right phrase, but we need to have confidence that we've done everything realistically possible to have the best possible information to make a decision on. And if we haven't gone far enough, then there's some culpability, which may follow, that could lead to some sort of penalty. So there's an obligation to get this right and to do the very best that we can to get the best information. But we also have to be pragmatic, and I think Louis
Exactly.
touched on that. It's not always possible to do. But nevertheless, it doesn't let us off the hook if we've made a wrong decision with
Yeah.
unsuitable data.
Yeah.
And the
And
buck
one more
stops with
point.
you, Louis.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
to go back to your original point, Mark, if we had to take out our crystal ball, what
Yeah.
would it look like? I think Mike, hit the nail on the head, and also you alluded to it. There's fines. There's also reputational risk, which might be even more of an issue than fines because, a fine, yeah, we could pay it off, whatever. We're still doing business, but reputational risk, it's harder to come back from. It's harder to rebuild your reputation after that. And also talking about my specific world of sanctions, you could introduce yourself to secondary sanctions if you're, not getting this right because, there might be a sanction owner, somebody, something has changed. We all know the crazy ownership structures that, the oligarchs have put into place, and other kind of jurisdictions or whatever. So, you know, that's, just to kind of set the stage here, those I think are the kind of key um, risks that you would face, right? Fines, reputational risk, and also you could face sanctions yourself. So that's something that we definitely want to steer clear from.
Want to avoid.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I suppose then to avoid that, it seems quite a challenge. I mean, I'm almost weeping at the eye for you now, Louis, because I'm realizing that sometimes you're probably up against it and you can't get blood out of a rock. Sometimes that's the way it is. But
Yeah,
you find stuff out there, and how do you collaborate? So I suppose my next part really is how do you
yeah.
collaborate with the regulators? So how do you help them do that So, and industry
Yeah.
stakeholders to, promote that transparency.
So, here in the Nordics, I feel like the collaboration between the regulators and the financial industry is quite good. Um, in the United States, I feel like it's not such a cozy relationship. But I think across the board, what I've heard is that, a lot of companies and financial industries are not comfortable speaking to competent authorities because they feel then that's almost tipping them off that they have an issue, right? And it could just be an honest question. They just want to level set or benchmark, but they feel like, oh, if I ask this question, they're going to come in here and they're going to, audit this specific thing, and I'm not going to be ready for it because they know I'm not ready for it. So I think it's a bit of a tricky situation. But from what I see here in the Nordics, it's a bit, yeah, a bit of what they say in Danish, hygge. It's a bit more cozy relationship. So, which is
Two-way
nice.
street.
But
Yeah.
yeah, but I think
Yeah.
in general, how these things happen is like in industry and banking associations. Like uh, minded businesses come together, they talk about these issues, they try to figure out kind of how they're being addressed to kind of figure out, how is the best way to go about it. Um, there's also just general benchmarking, and a phrase coined by the British, Chatham House rules. I think that's something that is used around the world now because we want to make sure that whatever we say stays in that room, and we could be completely comfortable in the items and issues we're discussing. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's probably more out there, but having to think about this in other context of this call, I think those are kind of the key areas and of how to not only within the industry, but also work with the regulators, because a lot of times these regulators are part of these industry meetings, either
Mm.
officially or they come in and out just when they're called upon. Um, there's something that I think some banks haven't, or I think it's something that all banks in the Nordics participate in. It's kind of where in each country they sit with the local regulators and kind of discuss the issues and kind of new regulations or old regulations or things they're facing. So again, if they come together and not in a one-off, they feel a bit safer. Um, and then you have communities like Wolfsburg and other stuff like that that kind of go to bat for a community to say, okay, we'll ask these questions for the community so that there's no kind of finger pointing. So yeah, I feel like those are kind of the key ways to have this communication. But yeah,
Yeah.
Mike, I'm curious to hear what you have to say on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you covered it well. I was thinking as you were talking there, key is structured information sharing and facilitating
Hmm.
information sharing, both between regulated entities within an industry, and between the public and the private partnership. I think those are key relationships that need strengthening. I think everybody's aware of it, and there's been some good initiatives. I was thinking in the UK, we've had the JIMLIT, the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, for a number of years. That's brought key stakeholders together to tackle some of the specific cases before they become law enforcement activities. So earlier in the stage when we've got suspicious activity going on, and I think most would cite that as having been successful. Some questions about could it be developed and taken further? Has it been emulated in other countries? Yes, to some extent. So we need to see more of those sorts of initiatives. But let's not also forget the role of the existing processes that are in place. So we've got, suspicious activity reporting. So the SARS scheme across which is observed by all AML regulated countries, is really important in terms of getting that information and promoting transparency to ensure that ultimately the law enforcement agencies have got good data to go and actually tackle these financial criminals and bring them to rights and let's say catch them. So it's fundamentally important. A lot of work's going on, and I know again, part of the Economic Crime Transparency Act in the UK was aimed at improving the information sharing. One of the big stated aims of that is to do this. But, it's patchy. It's not perfect. Some sectors are better at it than others. there's some individuals that are champions for this, and they really are very good at corralling the relevant stakeholders to bring them together. But there's a lot more that we can do. But ultimately, this is how we will improve the detection, prevention of financial crime.
Yeah, very
That's
good,
a great
Mike.
point. And just the last thing I want to say to that is now the SAR experience is coming to the sanctions world. So when it comes to sanctions circumvention, so yeah, on our side of the fence, we're trying to operationalize that. But yeah, that's a great point that SAR is also a good way to kind of share information across, especially with the regulator.
Very good point. Yeah. So I think we're looking for some questions that are coming in from the audience. So I want to see if we've got any. Just have a quick check. Have a quick time check. We've got 9 minutes left to entertain our vast audience from around the world that are currently cheering us along. If only we could see them like they can see us. I'm going to ask you a question which I think we might have asked before, Mike, but I'm just going to reiterate this because it's sort of come up as a point from an outside source. But how can businesses navigate complex ownership structures and ensure compliance when there's extended sanctions? So I think we've kind of touched on this before. Actually, we did talk about this, and I think Louis touched on this. But just your thought on that.
Well, I'd be interested to hear what Louis got to say because he's doing this in a practical way. But the theory of this is, of course, it comes back to our skill sets. We have to develop the ability to understand, to unpack, to pull apart a corporate complex corporate structure. I've got one I frequently use when I'm doing some training on this, and you look at it and you think, oh my goodness, how on earth could you ever unravel and identify the ultimate beneficial owner of such a complex web? I mentioned this before, where all sorts of little shenanigans are put in place, like trusts. Suddenly a trust appears, and well, that's a whole different kettle of fish in terms of understanding how to treat that as an element of a corporate structure. So there's lots of tricks of the trade that if a corporate structure is put together for illicit purposes that are used, and it makes it very difficult. But ultimately, we as the analysts, as the compliance side of the equation, have to develop the skill sets to understand how we can unpack these. Again, say it again, technology plays a massive part in helping us to do this, because we need to be able to visualize the work that we're doing, unpacking these organizations, because then you're going to identify key stakeholders, you're going to identify key directors, key shareholders as part of that process, the beneficial owners, depending on the criteria. Are we using 25% as the criteria? We're using 10%, which some organizations do, so that we understand that. And then we're going to be doing in-depth checks on those found individuals as well as the organizations. And then, as you've already said, it's that deeper, connection. What are these entities connected to that I should be thinking about deeper in the supply chain or deeper in the value chain of the organization? So you have to, there's no shortcut. We have to develop these skills within our organizations, and training is key to that. Yeah,
absolutely. Louis,
I think you hit the nail on the head with the last point. Training. Yeah. No, I mean, Mike hit the nail on the head with the last point. Training is key, right? Again, going back to fundamentals, we have to have the knowledge in order to be able to address these issues. And then it comes, the data, of course, and just the experience sometimes, right? We forget that, new analysts and experienced analysts look at things a bit different. And sometimes those are tough things to train on. But yeah, I mean, when you're talking, let's say, you're looking at these complex ownership structures, and you don't have, let's say, a nice data provider who's providing a web of how different companies are related or how they're related to a sanctioned individual. Ways that we do it with OSINT is sometimes looking at the address of the other companies. Okay, it doesn't look like they have the same owner, but they're using the same address. So okay, then that's a link. So sometimes it becomes more of like likelihood that they'll be related. So, we try to err on the side of caution a lot of the times, right? Because if we're seeing, data points that are similar and we can't disprove them, I then we have to just, be extra cautious around that. Um, and I know we operate in different jurisdictions, but sometimes if in your company or in your financial institution, if you follow multiple jurisdictions, the general rule of thumb is follow the most strict one. So,
Mm.
the point I wrote down here is like sometimes when you're looking at, OFAC and other sanctions regimes, it's like, okay,
Yeah,
well, I don't really sit in the US, but the fear of secondary sanctions, all right, we're going to go with OFAC's approach. So, um, I think that's kind of how it works. But yeah, to really be out ahead of it, data is key, really understanding and having that support, because to do all this research on your own is very time consuming. And sometimes it's easy to find it's easy to not see some of these links. So yeah, those data providers that do get it right, it's a blessing.
yeah, absolutely. And Mike, I mean, on that subject of OFAC and the 50% rule, have you got something you could, some words of wisdom that you can add into that?
Only to acknowledge the challenge.
Right.
The reality is that the implementation of the 50% rule, which I think came in about 2014 on the back of the first wave of Russian sanctions, when Crimea was annexed, what we saw immediately as a sanctioned data provider was a sudden transformation of organization structures, so that the sanctioned individuals suddenly put themselves out of the rule, beyond the reach of the authorities. But then the aggregate rule kicks in, so then you're having to calculate on an aggregate basis what's the total percentage ownership of that sanctioned individual, and who might they be linked to. It becomes a lot of detective work, and it's back to the same thing. It's the same as unpacking complex corporate structure. Understanding those sanctioned relationships under the OFAC rule is really difficult. So no shortcuts in this, no silver bullets. It's down to hard work. It's down to understanding what it means, and then building that picture up, and ensuring that you've not inadvertently exposed your organization to dealing with ultimately a sanctioned entity.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm conscious of the timeline here, and I can't see any other questions coming into the forum here. They might just pop up in any second. I suppose for some closing comments, I suppose we could have. I think I've seen some of the names in our audience, and they're probably looking for some pearls of wisdom from you two. They're not going to get it from me, because I'm just a pure pup compared to you two. So in technology, not in age, clearly. So I think one of these final questions that we've got. Final question here is: what are the barriers to unveiling the business true state? So of control due to complex ownership structures. So that's quite a convoluted question that we've been asked there. But if you can make head and a tail of that question.
Mike, I'll let you start with that one.
I think we've kind of answered, I think, most of this, because it's back to the same thing. It's understanding, the corporate structure requires quite a good knowledge of what company structures actually entail. You've got different types of entity, as I mentioned just now. There may appear to be a trust in there. Are we dealing with a listed company? Are we dealing with a private company? Are we dealing with a partnership? We need to understand the types of organizations that exist that we're dealing with, and then therefore what sort of information sources are available to us as we put the picture together. And that's something that we can learn. And then of course it's the bit that we touched on all the way through here, which is the fact that then we're reliant on finding data that helps us understand who these people are, who these entities are, what they're about, etc. So the barriers are availability of data, and the limitations of our ability and knowledge to actually do the task of understanding these complex structures.
Yeah. So I think
the main
on our
issue is
closing. Sorry, Louis,
understanding
go on, carry on.
sorry, I was like, Just quickly, I just want to say the main issue is also understanding what does control really mean, right? Because control can mean different things to different people. So there's different interpretations of, is that the board? Is that different type of titles within the board members or stakeholders? So I think that's where it also gets super complex to really just get your head wrapped around what does control really mean. And then really quickly, a last point on what Mike said on OFAC 50% rule. Yes, it could be aggregated, but then I believe there's also an issue if it's a different program. So that might also add a layer of complexity because it's not straight across. But yeah, I also say is we deal with a lot of issues and we're just trying to do the best we can. So business, if you're out there, we're trying to do the best we can.
So closing comments. I think we're at full time now, and for everyone that's hopefully it's been really useful. Our details are on the LinkedIn. So if you want to reach out to any of us and have a conversation, I'm sure both parties here, I speak for Louis and for Mike, I'm sure will be welcoming conversations with most people on the forum. Thank 100%. You very much, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks,
and
Mark.
I've definitely learned something today. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mike. Cheers, everyone.